back with one of our sermon shorts in the Knock Knock series, and we're talking about who's knocking on the door. Is it one of the 7 deadly sins that are knocking, and are we going to open the door to them? Or is it Jesus knocking on the door, and are we going to open the door to him? And today we're going to be talking about the ugly cousins of greed and envy. And we won't find a list of these 7 deadly sins in the Bible. It actually came about from the Greek monk Evagrius of Pontus in the 4th century AD. And what he was trying to do was give pastoral help to people so they could understand the roots of the sin that we all experience, so that something that's common to everyone. And this list has changed over the centuries with different theologians, but we still refer to them because they seem to be core sins that a lot of the other sins branch off of. And these sins knock on the door of our hearts. And they promise good things, but in reality, they bring death. Death in our relationships with God, with others, with ourselves, even with creation. But Jesus is also knocking on the door of our heart and asking if we will bravely open the door to invite him in so he can bring life where there is death. But I'm going to be honest, sometimes it can feel like dying as Jesus does this work in our life. And this is what Pete Scazzero calls the hard work of discipleship. He says this: let's face it, we all want Easter without Good Friday, light without darkness, hope without despair, happiness without suffering. The hard work of discipleship is necessary in order to let go of unbiblical ways of living and requires surrendering to the slow work of becoming formed in new ways by Jesus. So as we look at these sins, it's not about pointing out all the ways that we're failing at life or failing at being good Christians. It's about noticing the roots of these sin that are in our life that we might not have noticed before, and allowing them to be brought out into the light of Jesus' love and grace so that we can find forgiveness, freedom, and wholeness. And today we are going to look, as I mentioned, at envy and greed. And we call them the ugly cousins because these sins are both dealing with this desire for more, but in different ways. So we're going to start with envy. Envy is one of the have-not sins, and it sees something that someone else has and wants it. And what that means is not only do they want to get it, but they want to make sure that nobody else gets it. And if they can't have it, they don't want anyone to have it. At the heart of envy is the desire for identity. And identity is something we all have a need for. But are we going to go to envy to fill that need, or are we going to go to Jesus? And the envious person is one who compares. It's all about comparing ourselves. And I think of that movie, Snow White. And it's a movie about pride, but it's also about envy, as the queen wants to be the fairest one of them all, and she doesn't want any competition. In fact, she wants to eliminate the competition. And in the story that I just read from John chapter 12, the religious leaders at the end are the envious ones. They're envious of Jesus' success as he performs these amazing miracles. Just before the story, Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. People are flocking to him. So they're flocking away from the Pharisees and to Jesus. And the roots of envy are obvious as they not only plot Jesus' death, but now Lazarus's as well. They want to get rid of the competition. The religious leaders were not able to rejoice that Jesus was declaring forgiveness, healing, and freeing people. They needed to hold on to their identity as being particularly chosen by God and intellectually superior to others. Jesus was threatening this identity, and their only solution was to get rid of him. Well, how can we tell if we're struggling with envy? So Rebecca DeYoung gives us a list in her book, Glittering Vices, and this comes from an older church confessional manual. So this is how envy can show up in our lives. We might feel offended at the talents, successes, or good fortunes of others. We might have selfish or unnecessary rivalry and competition, pleasure at someone's difficulties or distress, ill will, reading false motives into others' behavior, belittling other people, false accusations, backbiting, which is saying something bad, even if it's true, behind someone's back. Slander, which is saying something bad, even if it's true, in the open about someone. And gossip in any form. I don't know about you, but I think I've participated in some of those things. She talks about how they start out really small, but they grow and grow to consume us with bitterness and hatred for our rival. So that's what envy does. And it makes me think of James chapter 1, 14 and 15. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. DeYoung calls envy a loser's game. For the envious person, winning means the other person loses, even if it means that you lose as well. And I think we can see why we need Jesus to free us from this deadly sin. So now we want to come to greed, envy's ugly cousin. And greed is a sin that says, I never have enough. And I think we've seen lots of caricatures, stories of greed on social media and stories, TV ads. The iconic one is Ebenezer Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Tale. And what he is the miserable miser. He can never earn enough money. He can never get enough. And he's so focused on accumulating money that he's not even willing to enjoy it. And he eats gruel for supper, which would be like a really thin porridge. And he has no desire to share with anyone else. The Bible often speaks of greed, making many references to money, even calling it idolatry. Tim Keller tweeted, Jesus warns people more often about greed than about sexual immorality, yet few of us think that we're guilty of it. And I think of what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:10. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and some people, craving money, have wandered from the true faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. Greed leads to sorrow. The person who's under the influence of greed tries to obtain happiness and security. So that core need for security, for happiness, that's something we all have. But are we going to go to greed to fill it, or are we going to turn to Jesus? Because the person who has greed in their heart can't trust or depend on God. Greed doesn't just affect us personally, but leads us to be callous toward others. And this is one of the key roots of injustice. And we think of how greed has impacted the poor, the vulnerable, the environment. Whole communities and cultures and countries have been impacted by greed. Greed tramples on the needs of others to get what it wants. Greed causes us to see others only in terms of their usefulness or value to society. Greed can't value people for who they are, only in terms of an economy. And we see this again in John 12, as Judas Iscariot is entrapped by greed. And it's interesting that in his greed, he's actually kind of has the appearance of being generous, because he's talking about giving the money away to the poor. But the writer of this story says that his motivation is greed. He wants money for himself. And he's willing to do anything to get more. It starts with stealing, and it ultimately leads to the betrayal of Jesus. So Judas's greed leads to the death of Jesus and his own death as well. Greed can even be found in the hearts of people who are generous, who give, because it's not how much we give, but it's the way we give. Contrast Judas's generosity with Mary's in the story. Mary was willing to pour out an expensive perfume to anoint Jesus. And commenter William Barclay points out that here we see love's extravagance. Mary took the most precious thing she possessed and spent it all on Jesus. Love is not love if it nicely calculates the cost. It gives its all, and its only regret is that it does not still have more to give. So this doesn't mean, though, that we can't be good stewards of our money or save up for university, for vacations, for the future. It doesn't mean that we can't enjoy the pleasures of life either. I think of a prayer in Proverbs 30:7-9. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Give me just enough to satisfy my needs. For if I grow rich, I may deny you and say, who is the Lord? And if I'm too poor, I may steal and thus insult God's holy name. So we need wisdom in how we use our money. Opening the door to envy and greed brings pain for us and for others, and can ultimately lead to death. What does it look like, though, for us to open the door to Jesus instead? I'm going to read to you from Isaiah 43, 1-2. Do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. Opening the door to Jesus means we hear him say these words, you are mine. And these are words of acceptance and love. These are words that remind us whose we are. We belong to Jesus. We don't belong to envy and greed. We have a profound new identity in Jesus through the cross. He has given us this new identity. But I have to admit, there's times that I don't know if I want to open the door when I hear Jesus knocking. And one of the reasons is I wonder if I can fully trust him. Does Jesus really love me? Will he really forgive me? Is his work in my life really good? Sometimes I'm also afraid to open the door to Jesus. What if he's going to punish me? What if he won't really help me and expects me to do it all on my own? What if this is the sin that makes him realize I'm not really lovable? These fears can make me hesitate to let Jesus in. But when I do open the door to Jesus, I realize that none of those fears and worries is true. Jesus isn't here to condemn or punish me. He took my punishment on the cross. He died for me. I belong to Jesus. I am his. And because I belong to Jesus, I don't need to let envy define who I am. I don't need to compare myself with others, trying to find any way that I can to make myself better than someone else. I know that I am a child of God, deeply loved and accepted. And because I'm accepted, instead of tearing someone else down, I can build them up by appreciating the gifts and talents God has given them, and even celebrating that God has made each of us uniquely. Because I belong to Jesus, I don't need to acquire more and more stuff to feel happy or secure. I don't need to live in fear that I won't have enough. I can trust that God will provide all my needs and that he will give me the grace to enjoy life and even thrive with less rather than more. I can trust that he knows what I need and will supply it. I think of Matthew 6, 31 and 32. And I'm now free to be generous toward others and give them the gift of enjoying God's provision as well. I can be part of bringing justice instead of injustice. Envy and greed, they can make big promises to fulfill my deepest desires and needs, but they only end up leaving me with broken relationships and empty dreams. Jesus promises life, real life, life to the fullest. It's not a life where my every wish is fulfilled, but it's a life of being loved, chosen, forgiven, accepted. It's a life of belonging, of purpose and meaning. And I don't know about you, but that's a life that I want. Through Jesus, we learn that we are his beloved. It is from this place of being loved that we are then able to love others. And when we open the door to Jesus, we discover his generous, lavish love. He gives us a completely different foundation for our self-worth, our identity, and our security. So one of the things we want to do is talk about some outside-in habits that we can practice. And these are things that we can start to do in our life. It's not all about Jesus doing it all. It's us doing it in partnership with him. So we want to do the outside-in habit of blessing others. So these are 2 simple practices that you can try, but just because they're simple doesn't mean they're always easy. So to counter envy, we need to a practice that helps us love others. So remember, envy focuses on comparing others, trying to make ourselves better than someone else. It doesn't want us to appreciate the gifts and talents of others. So instead, to counter envy, we want to bless others with encouragement. So it could go like this, to say to somebody else, I am thankful to God for you. I see, fill in the blank, in you. So this is something that you can do. You can either say it to someone, you could email them, text them, you could even write an old-fashioned note or card, but it's something that you want to say, a word of encouragement to someone else. And Mother Teresa calls these small things with great love. So we want to bless others with the gift of encouragement. So an outside-in habit to root out greed is to practice true generosity, not the kind of generosity that Judas was doing. And we need to pursue ways to bless others with our resources, the things that we have. DeYoung describes tithing as a way of limiting our use of a good thing to regularly and continually loosen our attachment. She says we need to give money, and giving money is a big part of it. Giving it away every week, giving our best, which means giving off the top, not our leftovers. So let's become people who practice blessing others. We can bless them with encouraging words, and we can bless them with generosity, with our resources. And I know I've been really thankful to people who've encouraged me and have been generous to me. And when I experience that, it makes me want to be generous and encouraging toward others. So it becomes this cycle of encouragement and generosity that we keep it going. So we want to close the door to envy and greed, and we want to open the door to Jesus, our Savior, the one who says, I love you, you are mine.